Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 17 of Book 2 of the Royal Rangers series, The Red Fox Clan. We're going to go ahead and get into it. It was cold in the tunnel, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light of the lantern after a few meters. Maddie walked in a slight crouch because the roof was low, although occasionally it seemed to open upward for at least another meter. Judging by the way the ground underfoot became unsteady and uneven, she guessed that these were places where the tunnel ceiling had collapsed. "Hope it doesn't choose to do that while I'm down here," she muttered. The possibility of being buried down here was an unpleasant one, and she realized, with a twinge of discomfort, that nobody knew where she was. If anything went wrong, she could be buried permanently. Maybe Uldred would remember that she had said she wanted to find the secret tunnels. But before any rescue party could set out after her, they'd have to solve the mystery of the concealed chamber in the lower cellar, then figure out how the secret door opened. Then the ceiling became lower, and the path became less cluttered and uneven, and she pushed the thought aside. It was awkward making her way in the restricted space. With no light other than the glow of her lantern, she had no reference points to tell her how far she had come, and none to indicate how far she might have to go. Too late, she realized that she should have been counting her paces to give her a rough idea of the distance she had covered. "Some explorer you are," she sniffed with disgust. At least the walls and floor were dry, unlike the section that went under the moat. That had been unpleasant in the extreme, with water dripping down from the roof and the ground squishing underfoot with each pace. Abruptly, she came to a blank wall of rock. It loomed out of the darkness, lit by her lantern, massive and unyielding. She felt a deep sense of disappointment. The journey ended here, in a dead end. There was no secret way out. The original diggers must have felt the same sense of despondency when they realized there was no way they could tunnel through this solid wall of granite that confronted them. She stepped forward, raising the lantern to study the rock more closely, and realized that this wasn't the end, after all. The tunnel took a 90-degree turn to the right to avoid the massive boulder that barred the way. The resultant path was narrow, and she had to turn side on and hold her breath to squeeze past it. But then the tunnel opened out and gradually curved back to resume its original direction. Her confidence grew once more as she followed the cleared path. Then the tunnel began to incline upward. She stopped. After at least half an hour of Stygian darkness, she thought she could see something up ahead. Unthinking, she advanced her lantern, and the brightness of its tiny yellow flame overpowered what it was she had seen, or imagined, in the distance. She lowered the lantern and held it behind her body to shield the light. Gradually, her eyes became accustomed to the near total darkness around her, and then she could see it again, a faint circle of light. She held the lantern forward again, and the small gray circle disappeared. She trudged on, stumbling occasionally on the rough floor of the tunnel, saving herself from falling with her free hand against the cold rock walls. 10 paces. She had begun to count now, then 20, and now the gray circle in the distance seemed to be clearly visible. She hid the lantern again, and the grayness stood out more strongly, becoming almost white, and it was twice the size it had been originally. She had no way of knowing how far it was. She just kept trudging and stumbling over the uneven ground, trying to avoid staring directly at the lantern. Whenever she did that, it took several minutes for her vision to recover and become reaccustomed to the gloom. She knew she must be getting close. The gray circle of light was growing larger with every pace. Gradually, it lost its circular shape and became oblong, more like a wide slit than a hole. The bottom was wider than the top, which tapered sharply. She knew she was looking at the end of the tunnel now, and she increased her pace, stumbling once or twice in her impatience. Suddenly, she just wanted to be out of this dark, gloomy hole in the ground. She wanted to breathe fresh air and see the bright sunlight once more. The exit didn't open directly to the outside world. It made another right-angle turn, this time to the left, around a rock outcrop. She squeezed around the rock and found herself confronted by a thick mat of foliage, overgrown branches and leaves that hid the tunnel's exit's existence from passers-by. She drew her sacks and began to hack at the tangle of leaves and branches, then stopped. No point in cutting haphazardly, she realized. If she did that, she'd leave the entrance exposed. She worked more discreetly, cutting only enough of the bushes to allow her passage through. Then she forced her way between the thick vines and the unyielding rock and shoved herself out into the open air. Breathing heavily, she looked around to get her bearings. She was in one of the small groves of trees and bushes that dotted the landscape of the castle park. It was large enough to provide privacy and shelter for couples who wanted to picnic here or spend quiet time together, but not big enough to shelter an attacking force of any kind. A few meters away from the concealed entrance, a wooden table and benches had been placed. It was typical of at least a dozen secluded spots in the parklands. She stepped clear of the entrance, dragging her foot free of the branches and vines that wrapped around it and tried to hold her back, and moved to the table to sit down. From there, she could see no sign of the entrance when she looked back at it. The rock outcrop concealed it almost completely, and any further sign of it was obscured behind the tangled bushes. Rising, she moved out of the grove, and suddenly she could see Castle Araluen rearing high above her. She was at least 150 meters from the castle gates. Looking back to where she knew the tunnel exit was, she nodded in admiration of those old tunnelers. They had come a long way, she thought. She turned and looked downhill to where she could see the roof of the local village rising above the treetops and a glimpse of sunlight on water that marked the stream that ran through the village. She recalled Duncan telling her that his ancestor had a girlfriend in the village and used the tunnel to sneak out and see her. "Well, great-great-grandfather," she said, smiling, "you were a naughty boy, weren't you?" On reflection, she realized, the tunnel must have been intended for a more serious purpose than her great-great-grandfather's secret trysts. Perhaps it was intended as an escape route in times of danger, or a means of secret access to the castle itself. If the latter were the case, she thought, it was no wonder its existence had been a closely guarded secret. Castle Araluen was regarded as virtually impregnable, but the tunnel under the moat provided a dangerous flaw in that invulnerability. As a result, the fewer people who were aware of it, the better. "Well," she said reluctantly, "best be getting back." The thought of leaving this pleasant world of green grass, sunlight, and fresh air for the dark, airless confines of the tunnel was decidedly distasteful. She picked up her lantern from where she had left it on the table and realized that she had neglected to extinguish it. She shook it experimentally, and the oil reservoir splashed with a hollow sound. She had checked that it had been full that morning, but she had been using it extensively since she descended to the cellar. The lantern felt less than half full now, and the thought of running out of oil halfway through the tunnel and being plunged into darkness did not appeal to her. She glanced at the sun. It was after the noon hour, and she knew the drawbridge guards changed at noon. That meant there would be nobody to question how she had gotten outside the castle walls if she went back in that way. Coming to a decision, she raised the lantern glass and blew out the tiny flame. Then she set out up the grassy hill for the castle gates. That afternoon, after a hurried lunch, she explored the remaining two tunnels. Both of them remained within the castle walls. The one that led east was relatively short. It led to a passage below the courtyard, and up a concealed stairway to the massive gatehouse that contained the machinery used to raise and lower the drawbridge. The stairway emerged at a point halfway up the walls, close to the mighty cogwheel that was turned to operate the drawbridge. It was in a cleverly concealed alcove behind the huge, heavy wooden beams and chains. Unless someone climbed up there, and there was no reason why anyone might, the stairway would remain undetected. The third tunnel was considerably longer. Its original direction was to the south, and it seemed to run straight, but without any outside reference. She had no way of knowing whether it veered to the left or the right. The only way of knowing would be to follow it to its end and see where it took her. It took her, after several hundred meters, to a chamber some 3 meters square. Set against the side wall was an angled ladder, or a steep set of a dozen wooden stairs. Holding the lantern high, she peered upward. At the top of the first set of stairs was a second ladder. Beyond that, the darkness prevented her from seeing more. She tested the stairs, gradually letting more and more of her weight settle on one of them, then climbing up a few steps, moving slowly and carefully. They seemed solid enough, so she began to climb in earnest. At the top of the first set, there was a small platform, allowing her to step to the next side and align herself with the next flight. After more testing, she mounted that and went up again. As she climbed, she looked up and could make out a third flight, aligned with the first, reaching higher and higher inside the wall. Above that, more darkness. She guessed from the height she had covered that she was ascending inside the outer wall of one of the towers, presumably the South Tower. After she climbed 2 more flights, she could make out a glimmer of daylight high above her. She found herself looking out a narrow slit of a window, high enough and narrow enough to be virtually invisible from the ground. The view from the window confirmed that she was climbing the South Tower. She recognized the ground below her and a partial view of the Western Tower to her right. Now that she was able to orient herself, she could see that this concealed set of stairs was on the southwestern side of the tower, in parallel to the large spiral staircase that led upward on the southeastern corner, which provided the main access to the upper floors. Here, high above the ground, the lighting on the stairs was more even, with those narrow slit windows positioned at every second flight of steps. She climbed all the way to the top, where she found a door. There was a small spy hole in the door, obvious because of the ray of light it emitted into the dimness of the hidden staircase. She peered through it and could make out a large chamber inside. It seemed deserted. There was a table and a dozen chairs in the room, and, on the opposite wall, a weapons rack where spears and halberds were stored. The door handle was in plain sight on this side. She guessed it would be concealed on the other side, as would the door itself. She placed her hand on the lever, tempted to lift it and let herself inside. Then she hesitated. The room seemed to be deserted, but her field of view was restricted, and there could well be somebody in there. If that were the case, it would not be a good idea for her to go blundering into the room, appearing through the wall as if by magic. She took her hand away from the lever. She'd need to find out more about this upper room. She'd never been here before. In fact, she had spent little time in the South Tower of the castle. "I'm going to need to do more research," she muttered under her breath. Then, reluctantly, she headed back down the narrow stairs and retraced her path through the tunnel to the cellar. All in all, she thought, it had been an interesting day. All right, that's going to be it for Chapter 17. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 18. God bless, and have a good one.